She was denied a room at her own hotel. What happened next shocked everyone. Hey there. Welcome back to Cracks of Light, where real stories meet powerful truths. Today's story. It's not just surprising. It's unbelievable. A 48-year-old black CEO walked into a 5-star hotel, a hotel she built with her own hands, only to be told, "Sorry, we're full. Guests only." But they had no idea who they had just turned away. No red carpet. No fancy heels. No name tag, just quiet power. And one phone call that turned the entire hotel upside down. Trust me, you're not gonna want to miss what happened next. But before we dive in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Cracks of Light so we can keep bringing you more stories that hit where it matters. Ready? Let's begin. She walked in just after sunset. No chauffeur. No assistant. No suitcase with a designer logo. Just a canvas duffel, worn but clean, slung over her shoulder like a quiet declaration that she had nothing to prove. The lobby of the Hamilton Grand was a glowing display of luxury: polished marble floors, towering floral arrangements, soft jazz floating from invisible speakers. She didn't pause to admire it. She'd seen it before, many times, but never as a guest. Not today. Her name was Vanessa, and she wasn't here for the spotlight. She was here for rest, one night of peace before a board meeting she hadn't planned on attending in person. She stepped to the front desk and offered a polite smile. "Checking in, please, under Claiborne." Vanessa Claiborne. The receptionist barely looked up. Blonde bob, red nails, tapping the keyboard like it owed her money. Her eyes flickered to Vanessa's face. Then her clothes. Pressed slacks, simple blouse, no visible branding. "I'm sorry," she said flatly. "We're at full capacity tonight. You'll need a reservation." Vanessa kept her smile, calm and steady. "That's all right. There should be a suite held for me. Always is." The receptionist frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Guests only," she repeated. "Corporate policy." Vanessa didn't argue, didn't flinch, just let her eyes drift toward the polished brass plaque on the wall behind the desk. Hamilton Grand. A Claiborne Collection property. Her name wasn't just on the guest list. It was on the building. She turned back, her voice still soft. "I am a guest," she said. "And more than that, I own this hotel." The receptionist blinked. For a second, it looked like she was processing a joke she hadn't quite caught the punchline of. Then, her mouth pulled into a tight, dismissive smirk. "You own the Hamilton?" Vanessa nodded, unbothered, not proud, not defensive, just stating a fact. "That's correct." The girl reached for the phone, her tone shifting to something vaguely sarcastic. "I'll need to call the manager." Across the room, two business travelers in golf polos paused mid-conversation. A man in a leather chair by the fireplace lowered his paper. Vanessa felt it, the shift, the air thickening, the subtle, familiar tension of being doubted in your own space, of being measured by people who had no idea what they were looking at. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flash an ID. She simply stood, steady, composed, while behind her the hotel she built pretended not to recognize its architect. The receptionist's fingers hovered above the keyboard, hesitating just long enough to make it awkward. Then came the rehearsed smile. That thin, customer service grin designed to say everything and nothing all at once. "I'm really sorry, ma'am," she said, each word clipped and sanitized. "But if your name isn't in the system, there's nothing I can do." Vanessa didn't flinch, didn't lean forward, didn't ask to speak to someone else. Instead, she took a slow breath and said quietly, "There's always a suite held for the owner. It's policy." Her voice wasn't demanding. It didn't need to be. It had the weight of someone used to being heard without raising the volume. The girl barely looked up. "I'm sorry, but without a confirmed booking." She let the rest hang in the air, unfinished, as if Vanessa would fill in the blanks herself and politely walk away. But Vanessa didn't move. Her hands stayed folded in front of her. Still. Then, in a voice so even it almost disappeared into the background music, she said, "I own this hotel." The words landed like a pin drop in a cathedral. Not loud, but sharp, cutting through the air with a clarity that made people stop, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Not with arrogance, not with desperation, just truth, unapologetic and calm. The receptionist blinked. A beat passed. 2. Then a scoff barely disguised as a chuckle. Right, she muttered under her breath, reaching for the desk phone, her acrylic nails clicking against the receiver. Somewhere nearby, someone adjusted their tie too tightly. A housekeeper paused mid-stride with a tray of champagne glasses. The world didn't stop, but it staggered. It was the kind of silence that demanded attention without ever asking for it. Vanessa didn't need to prove anything. Her power didn't scream. It waited. And that, more than any shouted argument, unsettled the room. They didn't have to say it out loud. They never did. It was in the way their eyes slid over her, cataloging every detail that didn't fit the picture in their minds. Brown skin, no jewelry, no designer handbag slung over her shoulder. Her blouse was soft cotton, not silk. Her shoes were practical, not polished for show. No assistant trailing behind her. No luggage with gold initials. Just her, standing there, quiet and composed. And that was all it took for them to decide. She didn't belong. She wasn't what ownership looked like. The front desk clerk didn't sneer, didn't roll her eyes. She didn't have to. The tightness in her jaw, the slight raise of an eyebrow, the way her fingers hovered just a second too long over the keyboard before pretending to search again, all of it spoke louder than words. The security guard at the entrance shifted in place, not moving toward her, but not turning away either, watching, as if waiting for her to cause trouble she never planned to make. The bellhop nearby glanced her way, then quickly looked down, pretending to check his phone. And still, she said nothing, because Vanessa had seen this before in airports, in elevators, in boardrooms. Always the same flicker of disbelief when she introduced herself. Always the questions disguised as small talk. And what do you do? Are you with the event staff? Do you work in PR? Never, not once, had anyone guessed correctly. Not because it was hard to imagine a woman in charge, but because it was hard for them to imagine her in charge. The assumptions lived in silence, in politeness so thin you could see through it. It didn't matter how many titles she held or how many buildings bore her name, there would always be someone squinting at her, trying to reconcile the facts with their own filtered version of reality. And the most exhausting part wasn't the doubt itself. It was how predictable it had become. She didn't pull out a business card or point to the gold plaque on the wall bearing her last name. She didn't open her phone to show emails, ownership documents, or a press photo from the ribbon-cutting ceremony 6 years ago. She didn't need to. Instead, she stepped back slightly, just far enough to lean against the marble pillar near the concierge stand. With one hand, she pulled out her phone, unlocked it with a single tap, and made the kind of call that didn't need a second ring. Her voice didn't rise, her tone didn't shift. It was calm, clipped, efficient, like someone reporting a minor system glitch. Not a personal insult. I'm at the Hamilton Grand, she said. I've been denied access to my own property. Please resolve this immediately. 26 seconds. That's all. No backstory, no outrage, no begging. She ended the call, returned the phone to her pocket, and stood still, her eyes moving slowly across the lobby, not with judgment, but with the quiet patience of someone who's been here before. A receptionist pretending to type, as if the screen might somehow rewrite the truth. A manager whispering into a walkie-talkie just out of earshot. Security adjusting their stance, just slightly, enough to show they were aware but not involved. No one dared to speak to her directly. No one knew what to do with silence that heavy. She didn't record it for the internet. She didn't shout. She didn't demand. She waited, not for validation, but for accountability. And in that stillness, the real shift began. Not with noise, with presence. The shift didn't come with sirens or announcements. It came with the soft chime of an elevator and the sudden stillness that follows recognition. The doors slid open and out stepped two men in tailored suits. One clutching a leather folder, the other already speaking into a Bluetooth headset. No name tags, no hesitation in their steps. They weren't hotel staff. They were the people staff answered to. Brent Kessler, regional vice president, moved with clipped precision, eyes scanning the lobby until they locked on Vanessa. Carlos Reno, district manager, followed a step behind, his expression somewhere between panic and damage control. The receptionist froze, her hands hovering midair like she'd forgotten what they were supposed to be doing. The assistant manager stuttered out a greeting, but Brent didn't stop to listen. "Miss Claiborne," he said, already nodding deeply, "we are so sorry for this." His voice was brisk, breathless, as if he'd sprinted through every floor to reach her. Carlos chimed in with the urgency of someone who knew his career was hanging in the air. "We've cleared your suite. The driver is being rerouted. Your usual fruit tray and espresso will be waiting upstairs." Vanessa didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply looked past them, just long enough to catch the stunned face of the receptionist, now pale, her mouth slightly open as if trying to form words she suddenly didn't have access to. The security guard who had been standing nearby took a quiet step back. No one needed an explanation now. The truth had arrived, not in anger, but in tailored suits and corporate authority. The very walls of the hotel seemed to lean in, adjusting themselves to the weight of the moment. And every person who had looked at her just minutes ago with skepticism or disinterest now couldn't look away. Because now they knew, and knowing changed everything. She didn't need sequins or stilettos to be seen. No diamond earrings, no flash of a luxury handbag, no entourage clearing a path. She moved through the marble-floored lobby with quiet precision, each step deliberate, unhurried, as if she owned every inch of the ground beneath her feet, because she did. Her flats made no sound, but somehow, her presence echoed louder than any heel could. Eyes followed her, not because she demanded attention, but because something about her made it impossible to look away. There was no flourish, no grand statement, no dramatic pause for effect. Just a woman walking calmly through a room that had just realized it had underestimated her. That's the thing about real power. It doesn't enter shouting. It waits until the noise dies down, then stands there, unmoved. Vanessa didn't have to prove anything to anyone, and that was what made them all scramble. Authority was never in what she wore, it was in how she wore herself. In the way her shoulders didn't slump, in the calm in her gaze, in the way her silence carried more command than their scripted apologies ever could. She didn't come to teach a lesson, but she became one. Not through confrontation, but through presence, through the simple, unshakable fact that she belonged here, and always had. As she stood in that grand lobby, surrounded by whispers and widened eyes, something older stirred beneath her calm. Memory, sharp and uninvited, rose like steam from the cracks in the polished marble. She was 23 again, standing outside a different hotel, resume folded neatly in her hand, nerves tucked beneath a borrowed blazer. She remembered the way the security guard looked her up and down before telling her she couldn't stand there. That applications were taken around back. He hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked why she was there. Just saw a young black woman and assumed she didn't belong. Another time, different city, she had walked into a boardroom in heels that pinched and a suit she'd found secondhand. She had arrived early, clutching her notes, ready to pitch a strategy she had spent 3 weeks building. A staff member passed by and asked if she could bring in more water. Called her, sweetheart. She nodded, said nothing, took her seat and waited for the meeting to begin. She hadn't forgotten those moments, not out of anger, but because they had shaped her. They had taught her what invisibility felt like. Not absence, but erasure. The slow, constant burn of being misread, mistaken, dismissed. And yet, she hadn't let it harden her. It had focused her, because change didn't start with power, it started with awareness. With the small, uncomfortable truths that had followed her through every hallway she ever stepped into. So she carried them not like wounds, but like compass points, not to remember the pain, but to never forget the reason she built what she built. so no one else would have to walk into their own future and be told to leave it at the door the next morning. The air in the hotel felt different, thinner, quieter, like the building itself was holding its breath. Vanessa stepped out of the elevator not as an overlooked guest, but as the CEO of the Claiborne Collection. The name etched into every contract, every quarterly report, every corner of that lobby. Her charcoal suit was crisp, her ivory blouse sharp against her skin, and her heels clicked with quiet authority across the marble. She walked past the reception desk without glancing at it, through the lounge where conversations fell silent, and straight into the executive conference room where the table was already full. Neil, the assistant manager, sat stiffly, face flushed, eyes darting between the table and the floor. Kayla, the receptionist, stared down at her hands, which were neatly folded but trembling. Next to them sat Marta from Our, notebook open, pen already in motion. Carlos and Brent were standing at attention, too rehearsed to seem comfortable. Vanessa didn't sit. She stood at the head of the table, arms crossed loosely, gaze steady but unreadable. For a long second, she said nothing, just let the silence settle. Then, finally, she asked, her voice calm but heavy with gravity, "Who wants to tell me what happened last night, from your perspective?" No one moved, not at first. Then a throat cleared, a breath caught, and Kayla spoke, barely above a whisper. "I didn't recognize you. I didn't think you were." She trailed off. Vanessa waited, not for excuses, not for apologies, but for honesty. She wasn't there to deliver punishment. She was there to create a moment they wouldn't escape with policy memos and training slides. Because this wasn't about customer service, it was about seeing who people are before deciding what they're worth. She didn't want regret, she wanted recognition, and she knew it had to start here, in this room, before it could ever touch the world outside those glass doors. The break room was quiet, tucked behind the staff lounge where no marble gleamed and no chandeliers sparkled, just a chipped coffee maker, a faded poster about hand hygiene, and the hum of a vending machine that hadn't been stocked in weeks. Vanessa stepped inside, and Kayla stood up so fast she nearly knocked over her chair. "Sit," Vanessa said gently, not as a command but as an invitation. Kayla obeyed, her posture tight, eyes wide, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blazer. Vanessa didn't pace, she didn't lecture. She pulled out a chair and sat across from her, elbows resting lightly on the table. For a few moments, she said nothing, just looked at the young woman in front of her, the nervous energy, the forced composure, the flickers of shame trying to stay hidden beneath the surface. Then she spoke, not with authority, but with memory. "You know," she said quietly, "I worked the front desk once, wore a paper name tag, got mistaken for housekeeping more times than I can count. Some guests looked right through me. Some smiled like they were doing me a favor." Kayla swallowed hard, eyes dropping. "I didn't mean to," she began. But Vanessa held up a hand not to silence her, but to slow her down. "I know, you didn't mean to offend. But you didn't mean to see me either." That landed, a slow, aching truth neither of them could ignore. "I'm not here for an apology," Vanessa continued. "I came because I want you to understand something. You didn't make a mistake at the keyboard. You made it here," she said, tapping her temple lightly. "The moment you looked at me and decided who I was based on what I wasn't wearing, who I wasn't with." Kayla's voice cracked as she said, "I thought I was being professional." Vanessa nodded slowly. "Professional isn't about guessing who deserves kindness. It's about offering it before you know who's watching." For a moment, silence stretched again, but it wasn't uncomfortable this time. It was real, thick with reflection, heavy with the weight of things not taught in training manuals. "You see," Vanessa said, leaning back slightly, "it's not about the suit or the skin color or the silence. It's about what happens in your head before you even speak. That's where change begins. Not with policy, with perspective." Kayla looked like she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she nodded slowly, a different kind of understanding settling into her shoulders, one that might not erase last night, but could shape everything after. Vanessa didn't need a podium or a PowerPoint to tell her story, just a table, a chair, and someone willing to listen. She spoke with the kind of clarity that only comes from lived experience, not rehearsed lines. I started behind a fryer, she said simply, voice steady. 17 years old. Grease burns on my forearms. Name stitched onto a polyester uniform. I worked doubles on weekends. Went home smelling like onions and dish soap. No one ever asked what I wanted to be. They assumed I already was what I'd always be. Her eyes didn't glaze over with nostalgia. They sharpened with memory. I became a server, then a shift lead, mopped floors, stocked shelves, got yelled at by managers who couldn't remember my name. I didn't go to business school. I went to work, every day, and when people laughed at my idea of opening a hotel, I didn't argue. I built one. She paused, but not for effect, just to breathe. The silence wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Even when they slammed doors, even when they looked past me, I never forgot to hold the door open for others. Not once. Because respect, she said, leaning forward slightly, isn't something you give when you think someone's earned it. It's what you offer first. Without proof, without conditions. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to be inspirational. She was just telling the truth. The kind most people keep buried beneath titles and success stories. I've been underestimated my whole life, she continued, but I've also been seen. Really seen by people who chose to look past what they expected and into who I was becoming. Her voice didn't waver. It deepened, grounded by years of being overlooked and still choosing to rise. That's why I built these hotels. Not for luxury, not for legacy, but to prove something to that girl at the fryer station. That she was never invisible. That no one is. And just like that, she didn't just change the room. She changed something deeper. Something quieter, something that would stay long after the chairs were pushed back and the lights turned off. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't pace the room or point fingers. She just looked at them, at Kayla, at Neil, at every face in the room, trying to look busy, trying to look small, and spoke in a voice that didn't command the room, but invited it to listen. I don't need an apology, she said, calm as a heartbeat. I need understanding. Because respect doesn't live in a job title or the cut of a suit. It lives in how we choose to see each other, especially when we think no one's watching. The weight of her words hung in the space between them, heavier than shame, gentler than blame. When someone walks through those front doors, she continued, you don't know if they're a guest, a CEO, or someone just looking for a warm place to sit. But you know one thing, they're human. And that should be enough. No one moved. The silence had changed. It wasn't filled with guilt anymore, it was filled with thought, reflection. We don't build brands with marble floors and room service menus, she said. We build them with how we make people feel when they show up uncertain, unannounced, unseen. That's where loyalty is born. Not from luxury but from dignity. She let the room sit with that. No script could teach this. No handbook could manufacture it. It had to come from somewhere deeper. Every single person who walks in here deserves to be greeted like they matter. Not because of what they wear. Not because of what they paid. But because they exist. Start there and you'll never have to recover from a moment like this again. She didn't just walk out of that meeting with a satisfied nod and a corrected mistake. She walked out with a plan, one that would reach beyond that lobby, beyond that staff, and ripple through every corner of the Claiborne collection. What happened at the front desk wasn't a fluke. It was a symptom, and Vanessa had no intention of treating the surface when the root ran deeper. Within 24 hours, a system-wide memo was issued. All staff, from bellhops to board members, would undergo renewed training, not just on hospitality, but on humanity. Not just how to greet a guest, but how to read a room with empathy. How to recognize the split-second judgments they made without even realizing it. And most importantly, how to unlearn them. New onboarding modules were drafted with a stony focus, real-world scenarios, bias awareness, inclusivity not as a checkbox, but as a lived standard. Performance reviews were restructured to evaluate not just efficiency, but emotional intelligence. Hiring managers were instructed to look for more than polished resumes. They were told to listen for compassion in a candidate's story, for curiosity in how they spoke about others, for humility in how they handled being wrong. Vanessa made it clear. Skill could be taught. Software could be mastered, but kindness had to be present from the start. She wasn't building a hospitality brand, she was building a culture. One that didn't wait for crisis to remind people how to treat one another. One that understood the deepest kind of service isn't about formality, it's about recognition. Seeing the human first, and letting every policy, every training, every hire reflect that one simple, radical belief. She didn't leave the hotel in a rush. She didn't need to. There was no storming out, no triumphant glare over the shoulder. Just a quiet exit, the kind that carried weight without force. As she walked back through the lobby, the same marble floors that once echoed with suspicion now held something softer: respect, recognition, maybe even reverence. Eyes lifted, but not with judgment this time. Not to scan her outfit or question her presence. They looked because they finally saw her. Not just the CEO, not just the name on the building, but the woman, the one who had walked in unnoticed and left unforgettable. The doorman who hadn't acknowledged her the night before opened the door with a subtle bow. No words, just a glance that said, "I understand now." The receptionist, still at her post, didn't try to smile through it this time. She simply looked up, held eye contact, and nodded, small, sincere, almost apologetic in its honesty. Vanessa didn't linger. She didn't perform, but her presence lingered long after the doors slid closed behind her. Because it wasn't her power that changed the atmosphere. It was her story, her refusal to shrink, her calm insistence that people see past their assumptions. And now, they did. She hadn't just corrected a mistake. She'd rewritten the temperature of that space. The lobby looked the same, but something invisible had shifted. Something that couldn't be reset with lighting or furniture. It was the weight of truth settling into the foundation. The kind of truth that doesn't need to be shouted to be heard. The suite was quiet, touched by the soft scent of eucalyptus and the last golden streaks of morning light spilling across the carpet. Vanessa moved slowly, not out of exhaustion, but reflection, her gaze drifting from the polished espresso machine to the neatly folded towels. The little signs of a hotel working hard to make things right. And then she saw it. A single folded note on the nightstand. No envelope, no official header, just a torn sheet of notepad paper. The handwriting slightly slanted, a little shaky. She unfolded it with the same care one might give to a photograph from long ago. It read, "Thank you for your patience. I'll learn to see people with my heart." Signed simply, Kayla. It wasn't a formal statement. It wasn't an HR memo or a corporate apology. It was something far more rare, a quiet acknowledgement of growth, of someone deciding to be different. Not because they were told to, but because something in them shifted. Vanessa held the note for a long moment, letting its simplicity settle, because in the end, this was never about status or punishment. It was about being seen. About reminding people that the smallest change in perception can be the biggest act of power. And this note, scribbled in real ink, from a real place of reflection that was worth more than a dozen scripted apologies. She slipped it gently into her purse, tucked between the edges of her planner and a photo of her daughter. Some things you don't archive. You carry them, because they matter. And maybe, just maybe, that's how real change begins, not in the policies we publish, but in the moments we choose to see each other fully. What would you have done if you were in Vanessa's shoes? Or Kayla's? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters. And it inspires us to keep telling stories that shine a light where it's needed most.